My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 30 years old, and I never thought I'd find myself sitting in the front row of a CEO's funeral, holding a secret that could change everything. The CEO wasn't just my boss. He was my mentor. Some might even say he was the closest thing to family I ever had. When I started at Whitmore and Hayes fresh out of college, I was the shy assistant who nobody noticed. He was the one who saw potential in me when everyone else rolled their eyes. And now he was gone. I sat stiffly in the pew, my black dress pressed, my eyes focused on the casket draped in white lilies. Around me, board members whispered in hushed tones, voices dripping with greed as much as grief. Who's going to control the company now? Probably Hayes. He always wanted the chair. Claire? Oh, please. She's just the assistant. She'll be lucky if they keep her on. Their words weren't meant for me, but I heard them. I always heard them. I didn't flinch. I didn't turn. Because while they dismissed me, I held a letter in my purse. A letter sealed with the late CEO's handwriting. A letter confirming that 50% of the company's shares had been quietly transferred to me. I hadn't told a soul. Not my coworkers, not even my closest friend. And I wasn't going to tell them here. Not yet. After the funeral, people gathered in the hall for the reception. I moved quietly through the room, ignored as usual, while glasses clinked and condolences flowed more like networking pitches. Hayes, the CFO, was already playing the role of heir apparent, shaking hands, smirking like the crown was his for the taking. I watched him, my jaw tightening. He'd always treated me like I was furniture. He never learned my name, just called me assistant. And now, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he'd been. But not today. Today, I let him smile. Because patience was power. And when the board meeting came, my silence would end. That night, alone in my apartment, I pulled out the letter again. The CEO's words were neat, deliberate, written in the same pen he used to sign every major deal. Claire, I trust you. You see people for who they are, not just what they pretend to be. This company needs that. That's why I'm leaving you 50% of my stake. Don't let them bully you. Don't let them win. I traced the ink with my fingertips, my throat tightening. They thought I was nothing. But I was about to be half the company. And next week, in that boardroom, I was going to show them exactly what a nobody could do. The Monday after the funeral, the office felt different. Normally, Whitmore and Hayes was a place buzzing with quiet confidence, suits striding across the marble lobby, assistants shuffling papers, the faint hum of deals being made in glass-walled conference rooms. But now it felt hollow. The CEO's absence hung heavy, like a missing pillar in the foundation. Yet, amid the grief, ambition filled the cracks. I could feel it in the way people whispered in corners, the way emails flew faster than usual, the way Hayes walked around with his chest puffed out, as though the company already belonged to him. And me? I kept my head down just like always. Because the more invisible they thought I was, the sharper my reveal would be. That morning, I was called into Hayes's office. Claire, he said, not looking up from his computer. We're moving some things around with the Sogon. You'll probably be reassigned once the board finalizes leadership. Until then, just handle scheduling. I stood there, my hands clasped in front of me, his words washing over me like static. Reassigned. He thought he was firing me for my own company. I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded politely. Of course, Mr. Hayes. He finally looked up, offering me a smirk. See? That's why I've always liked you. You know your place. If he only knew. Later that day, I was summoned to help prepare materials for the upcoming board meeting. It was surreal, sitting at the long oak conference table, listening as men in $1,000 suits casually discussed the future of the company as though I weren't even in the room. The CEO's death leaves a vacuum, one of them said. We need to ensure stability. Hayes is the natural choice, another chimed in. He's been grooming for this role. Anyone opposed? No one spoke. Except me, silently in my own head. I am. That night, back in my apartment, I spread the documents out on my coffee table. The CEO's letter. The legal transfer of shares. The The notarized confirmation. It was ironclad. 50% of the company mine. Half of every decision, half of every profit, half of the power. And yet, they still thought of me as the assistant. I leaned back on the couch, my heart pounding. The CEO had trusted me with this. He had believed in me when no one else did. And now it was my turn to prove him right. The days leading up to the board meeting were tense. I kept overhearing things in the hallways, snippets of conversations not meant for me. Hayes is already talking merger. Should we tell the shareholders yet? Claire? She'll be gone by Friday. Dead weight. Every word was like fuel. The more they underestimated me, the stronger my fire burned. On the morning of the meeting, I woke early. I dressed carefully, not in the plain skirts and blouses I usually wore, but in a tailored navy suit the CEO himself had once insisted I buy. One day, he'd said with a smile, "You'll need to look like you belong at the head of the table." I didn't fully believe him then, but I did now. When I walked into the office, heads turned. People didn't quite know why. It wasn't as though I was dressed extravagantly. But there was something different in my posture, my stride. I wasn't the invisible assistant anymore. I was an owner. The boardroom was buzzing when I entered. Hayes sat at the head of the table, already talking strategy with two directors. His smirk widened when he saw me. "Claire," he said, gesturing toward the chairs at the side. "You can sit over there. Just keep notes like always." I didn't move. Instead, I walked calmly to one of the main seats at the table. Not at the head. No, I wasn't ready to show my full hand yet, but close enough to make the room ripple with unease. One of the directors frowned. "That seat is for the board, Ms. Whitmore." I smiled politely. "I know." And then I sat. Hayes chuckled, shaking his head as though I were a child playing dress-up. "Let's get started," he said smoothly. "As acting head, I'd like to propose." But he didn't finish his sentence, because I pulled out my folder. I placed it on the table deliberately, the CEO's seal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Before we begin," I said, my voice calm but clear, "there's something the board should know." The room stilled. Every eye turned toward me. For the first time, they were looking, really looking. And I was ready. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Every eye was on me as I rested the CEO's sealed folder on the polished oak table. My hazel eyes stayed steady, my hands calm, even though inside my pulse raced like a drum. Hayes narrowed his eyes. "Claire, what are you doing? This is a board meeting, not a place for secretarial notes." I smiled faintly, keeping my tone even. "You're right. This is a board meeting, which is why it's time you all know the truth." Slowly, I opened the folder and slid a document to the center of the table. The official transfer of ownership, signed, sealed, notarized. The late CEO's handwriting stood bold and unmistakable. "I own 50% of Whitmore and Hayes," I said clearly, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "Effective immediately, as per his wishes." Gasps erupted around the table. One director leaned forward, squinting. This can't be real." Another whispered, 50%? That makes her equal." I finished for them. "Equal to Hayes. Equal to any of you." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Hayes laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. "Do you all hear this?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "She's trying to play games. Claire, you've been an assistant, not an executive. You wouldn't know the first thing about running a company." I kept my expression calm. "Funny, Mr. Hayes." The CEO seemed to think differently. He trusted me enough to leave me half his shares. Maybe he saw something in me you refused to see. His smirk faltered. Just slightly. But enough. One of the older board members, Mr. Franklin, cleared his throat. "Is this legally binding?" I slid the notarized confirmation forward. "Yes. Every stamp, every signature is valid. You can confirm with the lawyer who filed it." "I already have." The room buzzed again, directors flipping through the pages, whispering to each other in low voices. I sat still, letting them process the weight of it. Because for the first time, I wasn't begging to be heard. I was holding the truth, and the truth didn't need pleading. Hayes slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. She's been sitting in that office for years, filing papers, answering phones. You're telling me she's suddenly a board member? A partner? That's insane. I turned to him slowly, my gaze cool. You're right about one thing. I've been here for years. Which means I know this company inside and out. I've watched every deal, every mistake, every backroom conversation. I know who works for the good of the company and who only works for themselves. The implication landed hard. A few board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking to Hayes. His face turned red. You don't belong here, Claire. I leaned forward, meeting his glare. Get used to it, because I'm not going anywhere. The rest of the meeting descended into chaos. Half the board argued in hushed tones, trying to process what the documents meant. The other half stared at me like they were seeing me for the first time. Me, the invisible assistant. Me, the woman they had dismissed as dumb, as quiet, as irrelevant. And now, me, the equal owner of the company they thought was theirs for the taking. At one point, Hayes tried again. This company needs leadership, not charity cases, he sneered. We can't let sympathy decisions dictate billions of dollars. Sympathy? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Is that what you think this is? Then you clearly didn't know the CEO as well as you thought. He didn't hand me anything. He chose me. He saw value where you saw none. That's the difference between vision and arrogance. The room went quiet again, and in that silence, I could almost hear the CEO's voice in my head, steady and warm. Don't let them bully you. Don't let them win. I smiled faintly. Now, are we going to discuss the company's future, or are we going to waste time pretending I don't exist? By the end of the meeting, nothing concrete had been decided. Hayes stormed out, his face twisted in rage. The board members left in clusters, their voices low, their eyes flicking back toward me. But I didn't mind, because the seed had been planted. They could argue, deny, whisper all they wanted. But the truth was already rooted in the foundation. I wasn't their assistant anymore. I was their equal. And the next time we sat at that table, I would make sure they knew it. That evening, I walked out of the building into the cool night air. The skyscrapers glowed above me, the city humming with life. For the first time, I didn't feel small against them. I felt powerful, because I wasn't carrying a secret anymore. I was carrying my future. And no one, not Hayes, not the doubters, not the entire board, could take it from me. The fallout came faster than I expected. The very next morning, my inbox was flooded. Legal teams wanted clarification. Department heads wanted reassurance. And a handful of reporters had already caught wind that something unusual had happened in the Whitmore and Hayes boardroom. It was clear Hayes hadn't wasted any time spinning his version of events. He's calling you unqualified, the CEO's former secretary whispered to me in the break room. He's telling people you're just an assistant who got lucky. I stirred sugar into my coffee slowly, my hazel eyes narrowing. Then I guess it's time I prove I'm not. The truth was Hayes wasn't wrong about one thing. I didn't know everything about running a company, but I did know people. And people built companies far more than balance sheets ever did. So, instead of hiding in my office, I spent the next week walking the floors, talking to employees, listening to their concerns, asking questions no one else bothered to ask. And, to my surprise, they opened up to me. I haven't seen a director in years, one engineer said, blinking in shock when I showed up at his desk. Management only comes down here when something's wrong, a designer told me. You're the first person who's asked me what would make this job better. It hit me then this was why the CEO had chosen me. Not because I had an MBA or a polished resume like Hayes, but because I understood what they didn't. A company wasn't just numbers. It was people. Of course, Hayes wasn't going to sit back and let me build alliances. At the next meeting, he came in armed. He brought charts, projections, buzzwords meant to dazzle. He painted himself as the visionary, the only one capable of steering Whitmore and Hayes forward. And then he turned to me. Claire, he said, dripping sarcasm, perhaps you'd like to share your assistant's perspective? Laughter rippled through the room. I smiled faintly, gladly. I stood, calm, composed, and began to talk, not about abstract numbers or mergers, but about the conversations I'd had with employees, about the strengths and weaknesses I'd seen firsthand, about the culture that was fraying under leadership that only looked up, never down. By the time I finished, the room was quiet. And then one director actually nodded. "She's right. We've been disconnected from the ground level for too long." The smirk slid right off Hayes's face. That night, he cornered me in the parking garage. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he hissed, stepping close. I straightened, my hazel eyes unwavering.
"No.
"I just think I'm telling the truth." His lip curled.
You won't last."
"You don't have the spine for this." I smiled. "Funny, because it seems to me you're the one scared enough to chase me into a garage." For a moment, his face darkened, his fists clenching. But then he spun on his heel and stormed off, his footsteps echoing. And I knew I had rattled him. Over the next month, lines began to form. Some board members leaned toward Hayes, clinging to the familiar. But others, quietly, cautiously, began coming to me, asking my thoughts, seeking my perspective. I didn't push them. I didn't grandstand. I simply listened. And slowly, the tide began to turn. The moment I realized I had real leverage came in a small, unexpected way. We were in a budget meeting when Hayes tried to bulldoze through a proposal that would slash funding for employee training programs. "Waste of money," he declared. I cleared my throat. "Actually, cutting training now will only cost us more later. Retention is already dropping. We'll lose good people." He rolled his eyes. "That's sentimental nonsense." But then Mr. Franklin, the same director who had once doubted me, spoke up. "She's right. I've reviewed the reports myself. Retention is slipping." And just like that, the vote turned against Hayes. It wasn't about the training program. It was about me proving that my voice mattered. Still, the war wasn't over. Every time I gained ground, Hayes doubled down. He whispered in corners, tried to discredit me, painted me as naive. But what he didn't realize was this. Every insult, every underestimation only fed my resolve. Because I wasn't just fighting for a company. I was fighting for the man who had believed in me when no one else did. And I refused to let his trust be wasted. One evening, long after the building had emptied, I stayed in the CEO's old office. The leather chair still smelled faintly of his cologne. His pen lay where he'd last left it. I sat there, staring out the window at the city lights, and whispered to the empty room, "I'll make them see. I'll make them understand why you chose me." And for the first time since his death, I believed I truly could. Hayes wasn't used to losing. And after the board sided with me over the training program, he took it personally. The next week, I noticed the shift. Memos went missing from my inbox. I'd walk into meetings only to find they'd been moved at the last minute. Reports I'd requested suddenly got lost in the shuffle. It was petty sabotage. Transparent even, but dangerous enough to slow me down if I let it. I didn't. Instead, I documented everything: emails, timestamps, witness accounts. Hayes thought he was playing chess, but I was quietly building a case. Because the one thing the CEO had taught me better than anyone else was patience. "Don't strike every time you're hit," he used to say.
"Wait.
Let them dig their own hole. Then make sure everyone sees them fall into it." And Hayes?
He was digging fast.
The breaking point came during a quarterly review meeting. The room was packed, board members, senior executives, department heads. Hayes strutted in with a presentation that looked polished enough to sell ice in a blizzard. He clicked through slides of projections, market opportunities, potential mergers. His voice was smooth, his confidence rehearsed. And people were nodding. Then he got bold. "We have to accept reality," he said, clicking to a slide marked restructure. "The company cannot afford two equal partners. It sends the wrong message to investors. We need one clear leader, and I propose myself." The room stiffened. My pulse kicked, but I kept my face neutral. Hayes leaned back, smirking. "Claire's done her best, but let's be honest. This company needs more than hand-holding and pep talks. It needs leadership. And that means me." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Some heads nodded, Others shifted uncomfortably. I stood. Funny, I said calmly, because I was under the impression leadership was about results, not ego. All eyes swung to me. I reached into my folder and pulled out the documentation I'd been collecting. Pages of missed deadlines, failed initiatives, staff complaints, all linked to Hayes's decisions. If we're going to talk leadership, I continued, sliding the stack onto the table, let's talk facts. Over the past year, employee retention has dropped 15% under Hayes's direct policies. Client satisfaction fell after he slashed support staff. And those mergers he keeps proposing? Half of them are with companies tied to his personal friends, conflicts of interest that would sink us legally. Gasps rippled across the room. Hayes's face turned crimson. Those are lies. Documented. I cut in, tapping the stack. Verified. Every line backed up with dates, signatures, and reports your office conveniently lost. The room went silent. One of the directors cleared his throat. Is this true, Hayes? He stammered, his polished composure cracking. It's out of context. Out of context? I repeated, my voice firm. So, is asking the board to hand you total control while sweeping your failures under the rug. The silence grew heavy. And then, to my shock, Mr. Franklin, the man who had once doubted me, spoke up. Claire has a point. If we're discussing leadership, maybe it's time we consider that she's the one acting like a leader. Several heads nodded. Hayes's smirk was gone. After the meeting, he stormed past me in the hallway, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. You think you've won? He growled. I looked him dead in the eye.
No.
I think the company has. He glared, but said nothing, because for the first time he knew he was losing. That night, I sat at my desk, staring out at the city skyline. I thought about the girl I used to be, the assistant who stayed silent, who let people laugh at her, who let men like Hayes walk all over her. And I thought about the woman I was becoming. The woman who stood up, who fought back, who held her ground in rooms that once ignored her. The CEO had believed in me when no one else did. And now I was proving him right. But I also knew something else. Hayes wasn't finished. He was too proud, too desperate to accept defeat. And the next move he made wouldn't be petty memos or missing emails.
It would be war.
And I needed to be ready. Hayes didn't waste time. After I exposed him in the quarterly review, I knew he wouldn't lick his wounds quietly. He was too arrogant, too desperate to let go of the crown he thought was already his. And sure enough, his counterstrike came within a week. It started with whispers. Employees stopping mid-sentence when I walked into a room. Odd looks from people I trusted. A sudden drop in emails that had once landed in my inbox like clockwork. I didn't have to guess. Hayes was poisoning the well. The official blow landed 3 days later. I was called into a special session with the board. When I walked in, Hayes was already there, sitting smugly at the head of the table. Claire, he said smoothly, serious allegations have been raised about you. We need to address them. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were fabricated expense reports, twisted emails, doctored receipts, all painting me as reckless, incompetent, even corrupt. This is absurd, I said evenly, though my pulse raced. Hayes smirked. The evidence speaks for itself. I looked around the table. A few directors shifted uncomfortably. They weren't convinced, but they weren't dismissing it either. And that was exactly what Hayes wanted.
Doubt.
I didn't argue. Not then. Instead, I closed the folder calmly, slid it back toward him, and said, if you're so sure of your evidence, then you won't mind a full independent audit. Starting tomorrow. The color drained from his face, just slightly. Enough to tell me I'd hit the right nerve. Because men like Hayes thrived on shadows. And I had just lit a floodlight. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, pulling every file, every report, every scrap of documentation I'd saved since the CEO's death. And I realized something. Hayes wasn't just sloppy. He was greedy. In his desperation to undermine me, he'd left a trail of his own mistakes, conflicts of interest, misappropriated funds, insider dealings that would make the board's head spin. He thought he was burying me. But he dug his own grave. At the next board session, the air was electric. Hayes strutted in, clearly convinced this was his coup. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it's time we face facts. Claire isn't fit to lead. The evidence is clear, she's a liability." He gestured grandly toward his stack of forged reports. I waited until the murmurs died down. Then slowly I stood. "Actually," I said, placing my own folder on the table, "it's time we face the real facts." I opened it and began laying out documents one by one. Bank transfers that linked Hayes to questionable vendors, emails showing conflicts of interest, discrepancies in budgets he had signed. And then, the piece de resistance, a whistleblower's testimony from someone in finance who had quietly come forward after hearing Hayes was targeting me. Gasps filled the room. One director whispered, "Good God." Hayes's face strained of color. This is a setup." "No," I said firmly, my voice ringing clear. "This is the truth. And the truth doesn't need lies to stand." The room erupted into chaos. Directors flipped through the documents, their expressions shifting from skepticism to outrage. Words like fraud and breach of trust hissed through the air. Hayes slammed his hand on the table. "You can't believe her. She's manipulating you." But no one was listening to him anymore. Because the evidence wasn't mine. It was his. When the shouting died down, Mr. Franklin spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "I was wrong about you, Claire. You're not just fit to lead. You're exactly what this company needs." Hayes, on the other hand, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. The vote was called. And just like that, Hayes was suspended pending investigation. I sat there, my hands folded, my face calm. But inside, I felt the ground shift beneath me. For months, I had been the invisible assistant, the underestimated woman, the pawn everyone thought they could move around.
Now?
I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't a pawn. I was the queen. And the boardroom had just learned what happens when you underestimate her. That night, as I left the building, the city lights felt different. Brighter, sharper, almost electric. I thought about the CEO again, his steady voice, his unwavering belief in me. "You see people for who they are, Claire. That's why I trust you." And for the first time since his death, I felt like I'd truly honored him. Because I hadn't just survived Hayes's games. I had beaten him at them. But even as I stepped into the night air, one truth lingered. This wasn't over. The investigation would drag on. Hayes wasn't the type to disappear quietly. And there were still plenty of eyes watching, waiting to see if I would stumble. But I wasn't afraid. Because I had already faced the worst of their ridicule, their sabotage, their betrayal. And I was still standing, stronger than ever. The weeks that followed Hayes's suspension felt surreal. For years, I had been the shadow in the corner of the room, the assistant taking notes while men like him dictated the future of Whitmore and Hayes. And now, suddenly, I wasn't just in the room. I was at the table. No, I was the table. Half of it anyway. The board officially confirmed what I already knew. The CEO's transfer of shares was binding. I wasn't just a shareholder. I was the largest one. Hayes's 25% meant nothing against my 50. He was a sinking ship, and I was the tide rising without him. The first time I walked into the CEO's old office as its rightful co-leader, I froze. The leather chair. The view over the city skyline. The shelves still lined with his books and notes. It wasn't just an office. It was a promise. I sat down in the chair slowly, my fingers brushing the desk, and whispered into the quiet, "I'll do it right. I'll make you proud." For the first time in months, I didn't feel the ache of loss as sharply. Because now I wasn't just surviving him being gone. I was carrying him forward. Of course, it wasn't easy. Some directors still looked at me like I didn't belong. Investors hesitated. A few employees wondered if I was just a placeholder until someone more experienced came along. But every day, I proved them wrong. I showed up. I made decisions. I listened when no one else did. And slowly, the skepticism turned into something else. Respect. The moment I knew things had shifted came during a strategy session. One director started to push back against my proposal for a new mentorship program, saying it was idealistic. Before I could respond, another director, one who had once ignored me completely, spoke up. Actually, Claire's right. We need this. She sees things we've missed. The room nodded, and for the first time, I didn't have to fight for my voice. They gave me the floor willingly. Hayes, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. His investigation dragged on, each new discovery worse than the last.
Fraud.
Backroom deals. Self-serving contracts. Every week, another piece of his empire crumbled. And every week, mine grew stronger. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I walked the office halls alone. The building was quiet, the city outside glowing like 1,000 stars. I stopped at the CEO's portrait in the main hallway. He stared back at me, his eyes calm, his smile faint. "I did it," I whispered. "They thought I was nothing. But you knew. You always knew." A warmth spread through me. Not arrogance, not pride.
Peace.
At the next shareholder assembly, I stood on stage for the first time. The crowd of investors, employees, and partners filled the grand hall, their eyes fixed on me. Months earlier, the thought would have paralyzed me.
But now?
Now I stood tall. "My name is Claire Whitmore," I began, my voice steady. "And for years, I was the assistant no one noticed. But today, I stand before you as co-leader of Whitmore and Hayes, not because of chance, but because of trust. Trust placed in me by the man who built this company. Trust one intend to honor by building it stronger than ever." Applause erupted, thunderous and genuine. In that moment, I knew the transformation was complete. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was undeniable. That night, back in my apartment, I opened my journal and wrote the final words of this chapter of my life.
They ignored me. They mocked me.
They called me unqualified. But when the truth came to light, the same people who laughed were forced to listen. Because power doesn't come from their approval. It comes from knowing your worth and refusing to be silenced. And now, I'm not just part of the story of this company. I am the story. I set the pen down, my hazel eyes glistening, and smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't just feel like I belonged. I knew I did.